The galactic communion had existed for 3,000 years. In that time, they had found and studied over 12 million intelligent species across the known universe. They had seen civilizations that lived inside stars. They had documented beings made entirely of light. They had cataloged creatures that existed in dimensions no human mind could understand. Nothing surprised them anymore. Nothing scared them. They believed they had seen everything the universe had to offer. They were wrong. Commander Vex Thrall stood on the bridge of his survey vessel, watching the data streams flow across his display screens. His species, the Dominion, had been exploring the galaxy for longer than most civilizations had existed. He had personally cataloged over 200 new species during his career. Most of them were primitive. A few were interesting. None of them had ever made him feel anything close to concern. The ship had detected radio signals coming from a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. This was not unusual. Young civilizations often broadcast signals into space without understanding that anyone might be listening. It was like watching children play with fire. Amusing, perhaps, but hardly noteworthy. Vex Thrall ordered a stealth probe to investigate. The probe was equipped with technology far beyond anything the primitive species could detect. It would observe, collect data, and transmit its findings back to the survey vessel. Standard procedure. Routine work. The probe entered the system and took up position near the third planet from the Sun. Initial scans confirmed what Vex Thrall had expected. Carbon-based bipedal life forms. Primitive combustion technology. They had managed to reach their own moon a few decades ago, but had not ventured much further. Their communication systems were crude. Their weapons were dangerous only to themselves. By communion standards, they were barely worth noting in the archives. Then the probe began downloading their historical records. The planet's inhabitants called themselves humans. They lived on a world they named Earth. They had developed a global communication network that contained nearly all of their accumulated knowledge, freely accessible to anyone who knew how to look. The probe looked. It found everything. Vex Thrall reviewed the initial summary and felt something he had not experienced in over a century of service. He felt confused. The data did not match any known pattern. These creatures were simultaneously more primitive and more terrifying than anything in the Communion archives. He transmitted the full data package to the homeworld and requested guidance. On the Communion capital planet, Senior Archivist Zael-Un received the transmission in her private study. She was old, even by the standards of her long-lived species. She had spent 400 years organizing and analyzing data about alien civilizations. She had developed the threat assessment protocols that the entire Communion used. She had seen the records of species that had destroyed their own worlds, species that had conquered dozens of systems, species that had developed weapons capable of cracking planets in half. She opened the human files and began to read. 3 hours later, she had not moved. Her staff found her staring at her display screen, her normally calm features twisted into an expression none of them had ever seen before. When they asked if she was well, she did not respond. She simply reached out and initiated an emergency summons to the High Council. This had never happened before. In 400 years of service, Zael-Un had never once requested an emergency session. The council members received her summons with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They assembled in the great crystalline chamber within hours. Meanwhile, on Earth, the sun was setting over California. Dr. Katie Morgan sat in her small office at the SETI Institute, surrounded by equipment that scanned the skies for signs of intelligent life. She had been doing this work for 15 years. She had never found anything conclusive. Strange signals occasionally appeared, but they always turned out to be natural phenomena or equipment errors. She had learned not to get excited. Tonight was different. Katie stared at her monitor, watching a pattern she could not explain. The background radiation data showed subtle fluctuations that did not match any known source. It was almost as if something was out there, watching, sending small pulses of energy in their direction. She called her colleague into the room. Dr. Ben Harper was younger than Katie, more skeptical, and far less patient with anything that smelled like false hope. He had joined SETI because he believed in the mission. But years of silence had made him cynical. Ben looked at the data and shrugged. He told Katie it was probably equipment noise, solar interference, maybe a satellite malfunction. He reminded her that they had seen patterns like this before, and they had always turned out to be nothing. Katie wanted to argue, but she knew he was probably right. She saved the data anyway, just in case, and decided to run more tests in the morning. She had no way of knowing that the fluctuations she had detected were coming from a probe positioned just beyond the orbit of Mars. She had no way of knowing that the probe was currently transmitting everything humanity had ever recorded about itself to an alien civilization that had never encountered anything like them. She had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, the entire galaxy would change forever. In the crystalline chamber of the High Council, Senior Archivist Zael-Un stood before the 12 most powerful beings in the Galactic Communion. Her display matrix was ready. Her data was organized. Her presentation was prepared. But her hands were shaking. High Counselor Kirmoth, leader of the Velen Hive and senior member of the Council, noted her distress with growing unease. Zael-Un was known throughout the Communion for her unshakable composure. To see her like this was deeply unsettling. He asked her to begin. Zael-Un took a breath and activated the display. Images of Earth appeared. Blue and green and beautiful, floating in the darkness of space. It looked peaceful. It looked harmless. She told the Council that appearances were deceiving. She told them that she had reviewed over 10,000 years of human history. She told them that she had analyzed their biology, their psychology, their social structures, and their technology. Then she told them that she had no idea how to classify them. The Council members exchanged glances. This was not what they had expected. They had expected a threat assessment, a recommendation, a clear path forward. They had not expected uncertainty. Zael-Un saw their confusion and understood it. She had felt the same way when she first reviewed the data. She told them that the only way to understand was to see for themselves. She began the presentation. The chamber fell silent. Across the galaxy, in observatories and communication centers and military installations, the silence was already beginning to spread. Word traveled fast in the Communion. Rumors of the human files were leaking out. Species that had never shown interest in primitive worlds were suddenly demanding access to the archives. Something was coming. Something none of them were prepared for. And on Earth, Katie Morgan went home to her apartment, made herself dinner, and went to bed early. Tomorrow would be another day of searching the skies for signs of life. She had no idea that life had already found her. The crystalline chamber had witnessed many things over the centuries. It had seen the formation of alliances that spanned galaxies. It had seen declarations of war that resulted in the deaths of billions. It had seen the rise of empires and the fall of civilizations. But it had never seen anything like what happened when Senior Archivist Zael-Un began her presentation on humanity. The display matrix filled with images and data streams showing the history of a small blue planet and the creatures who lived on it. The Council members watched in silence as the story unfolded. Zael-Un started at the beginning. She showed them how humans had evolved on a world that seemed determined to kill them. The planet's climate shifted constantly. Ice ages came and went. Predators hunted them. Diseases ravaged their populations. Natural disasters destroyed their settlements again and again. Any reasonable species would have died. Humans did not. High Counselor Kirmoth leaned forward as Zael-Un explained how early humans had survived. They had no natural weapons. They were not particularly fast or strong. They could not fly or swim great distances. They had no venom, no armor, no camouflage. By all logical standards, they should have been easy prey. Instead, they became the most successful predators their planet had ever seen. Zael-Un showed the Council footage of human hunting techniques. She explained a concept called persistence hunting. Humans could not outrun their prey. But they did not need to. They simply followed their targets for hours, sometimes days, never stopping, never resting, until the animal they were chasing collapsed from exhaustion and died. Humans had evolved to move continuously, without rest longer than almost any other creature on their world. Counselor Thalmex of the Serenity Collective, a species that had eliminated all forms of violence from their society through genetic modification, shifted uncomfortably. His people had no frame of reference for this kind of behavior. They found it deeply disturbing, but Xiaolun was not finished. She moved forward in time, showing how humans had developed tools and weapons. They learned to make fire and used it to reshape their environment. They built shelters that protected them from the elements. They domesticated other animals and forced them to serve human needs. They planted crops and bent nature itself to their will. Then they turned their attention to each other. The council watched as human history unfolded in a cascade of violence that seemed to have no end. Wars, genocides, conquests, betrayals. Humans had been fighting each other since before they had developed writing. They fought over land, resources, beliefs, pride, and sometimes for reasons that seemed to make no sense at all. Xiaolun paused the presentation and looked at the council. She told them that what came next was difficult to watch. She recommended that anyone with a sensitive disposition should prepare themselves. No one left. The display showed something called the First World War. Humans had developed industrial technology and immediately used it to kill each other on a scale never before seen. Millions died in muddy trenches, fighting over small patches of ground that had no strategic value. They used poison gas that melted lungs. They used machines that fired metal projectiles faster than the eye could see. They used explosives that could destroy entire cities. And when it was over, they did it again. The Second World War killed even more. Xiaolun showed the council images of destruction so complete that even species who had witnessed planetary bombardment found it shocking. Cities burned. Populations were systematically exterminated. And then, at the end, humans did something that changed everything. They split the atom. They took the fundamental building blocks of the universe and turned them into weapons. And then, knowing exactly what these weapons could do, they used them. Twice. On their own cities, on their own people, Counselor Thalmex of the Serenity Collective collapsed into a dormant state. His species had emergency shutdown protocols that activated when they encountered information too disturbing to process. He would not wake for several hours. The other council members remained conscious, but barely. Xiaolun continued. She showed them how humans had continued to develop nuclear weapons after the war. They built enough to destroy their entire planet many times over. They aimed them at each other and waited. Each side ready to end all life on Earth if the other made a wrong move. They called this strategy mutually assured destruction. They considered it a form of peace. High Counselor Kirmoth raised a trembling appendage and asked Xiaolun to stop. He said he had seen enough. He said he understood why she had called this emergency session. Xiaolun told him that he did not understand. Not yet. She told him that the wars were not the most disturbing thing about humans. The council waited in horrified silence. Xiaolun explained human biology. She told the council about a chemical called adrenaline. When humans were in danger, their bodies released this substance into their bloodstreams. It increased their strength, sharpened their senses, and most importantly, it blocked their ability to feel pain. This was not unusual. Many species had similar survival mechanisms. What made humans different was what they did with it. Humans had developed activities specifically designed to trigger this response. They jumped from high places, with only thin fabric, to slow their fall. They drove vehicles at deadly speeds around circular tracks. They fought each other in organized matches, breaking bones and spilling blood, while thousands watched and cheered. They did these things voluntarily. For entertainment. For fun. Admiral Kirvex of the Dominion Fleet, a military commander who had seen countless battles, asked a question. He wanted to know how humans recovered from their injuries. Xiaolun told him that human bodies could repair damage that would kill most other species. Broken bones healed. Wounds closed. Humans could lose limbs and continue functioning. They could have parts of their internal organs removed and survive. They could even replace damaged parts with mechanical substitutes and continue living. She showed the council images of human soldiers who had lost arms, legs, and eyes in combat. Many of them had returned to fighting. Some had returned multiple times. The council sat in stunned silence. Xiaolun told them there was one more thing they needed to see. She told them about human children. She explained how human offspring were born completely helpless. They could not walk, feed themselves, or survive without constant care. Human parents devoted years of their lives to protecting and nurturing their young. This seemed normal enough. Many species did the same. But then Zalun showed them what some humans did to children: abuse, neglect, exploitation, violence. She showed them that the same species capable of extraordinary parental sacrifice was also capable of extraordinary cruelty toward its most vulnerable members. The same individuals could sometimes be both. High Counselor Kirmoth finally understood what Zayalun had been trying to tell them. Humans were not simply dangerous. They were not simply violent. They were impossible to predict because they contained every possibility within themselves. A human could be a hero or a monster. Often, they were both. Zayalun turned off the display and faced the council. She told them that she had spent 400 years studying alien civilizations. She had developed threat assessment protocols used throughout the communion. She had classified species as peaceful, aggressive, territorial, and everything in between. She did not know how to classify humans. She could not recommend a response because she did not understand what they were dealing with. The council sat in silence for a long time. Finally, High Counselor Kirmoth spoke. He ordered that the human files be distributed to every member species of the communion. He ordered that all survey vessels maintain a safe distance from the Sol system. He ordered that no contact be made under any circumstances. And he ordered that the communion begin preparing for the possibility that one day, humans would leave their planet and come looking for them. The greatest silence the galaxy had ever known was about to begin. The human files spread across the galactic communion faster than any information had ever traveled before. Within hours of the High Council's decision, every species with access to the archives had begun downloading the data. Within days, civilizations that had never shown interest in primitive worlds were consuming every piece of information available about Earth and its inhabitants. The response was unlike anything the communion had ever witnessed. On Nexus Station, the largest trading hub in the known universe, the normally chaotic markets fell silent. Merchants from hundreds of different species stood motionless before shared display screens, watching the human archives play out in all their terrible glory. Deals worth fortunes were abandoned mid-negotiation. Ships sat idle in docking bays as their crews gathered to witness the revelation. A Velen trader turned to his companion and spoke in a trembling voice. He said that humans threw themselves out of aircraft while they were still in flight. He said they attached thin fabric to their backs and fell toward the ground, only opening the fabric at the last possible moment. He said they called this activity skydiving, and they did it for enjoyment. His companion did not respond. There was nothing to say. On the homeworld of the Triumvirate of Kos, the Warrior Council convened an emergency session. The Kos had built their entire civilization on military conquest. They had subjugated 8 star systems through superior tactics and ruthless efficiency. Their soldiers were considered among the finest in the galaxy. Their generals were studied in military academies across the communion. General Vorketh, the most decorated commander in Kos history, stood before the council and delivered his assessment of human warfare. He had spent 3 days reviewing their military history. He had analyzed their strategies, their weapons, and their willingness to accept casualties. What he found had shaken him to his core. He told the council about something humans called trench warfare. During their First World War, opposing armies had dug long ditches in the ground and faced each other across open fields. Soldiers lived in these trenches for months and years at a time, surrounded by mud, disease, and the bodies of their fallen comrades. Every few days, commanders would order them to climb out of their trenches and run directly into enemy fire. Thousands would die in minutes, and then they would do it again. The council members listened in growing disbelief. Vorketh continued. He told them that human soldiers did not stop when they were wounded. They did not surrender when their positions became hopeless. They did not retreat when logic demanded it. They fought until they were physically unable to continue. And sometimes, even then, they kept fighting. He told them about a human concept called the last stand. When human warriors knew they could not win, when escape was impossible and death was certain, they did not simply accept their fate. They chose to make their deaths as costly as possible for their enemies. They fought with everything they had until their final breath. The first blade of the triumvirate asked Vorketh for his tactical recommendation. If the Koss ever encountered humans in battle, what should they do? Vorketh was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that no Koss general had ever said before. He said they should avoid contact at all costs. He said that if contact was unavoidable, they should surrender immediately. He said that fighting humans was not warfare, it was suicide. The council dismissed him without comment. Within a week, they had begun discussing the disbandment of their military forces. If the humans ever reached the stars, armies would be meaningless. If they did not, the Koss no longer had the heart for conquest. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out. The Serenity Collective announced that they were implementing new genetic modifications to remove curiosity from their population. It was safer not to think about humans at all. The Velen Hive developed new religious practices centered on a single prayer, repeated endlessly. Let them not notice us. The gaseous beings of the Drift Consortium simply stopped communicating with other species entirely, retreating into isolation. Trade routes that had operated for millennia went quiet. Diplomatic channels fell silent. Scientific expeditions were canceled. The great network of communication that connected the communion began to break down. Not through conflict or disaster, but through fear. On Earth, Dr. Katie Morgan noticed that something strange was happening. She sat in her office at the SETI Institute, reviewing the data from the previous month. The patterns she had noticed before were changing. The background radiation fluctuations had decreased dramatically. It was as if whatever had been watching them had suddenly gone quiet. More concerning was what she found when she expanded her search. For decades, SETI had detected faint signals from distant sources. Most of them turned out to be natural phenomena, but some had never been explained. Those signals had been a source of hope, a suggestion that maybe, somewhere out there, someone was trying to communicate. Now they were gone. Katie ran her analysis again. She checked her equipment. She compared her findings with data from other observatories around the world. The results were the same everywhere. The universe had fallen silent. She called Ben Harper into her office and showed him what she had found. For once, he did not dismiss her concerns. He stared at the data with the same confusion she felt. He suggested that maybe their equipment was malfunctioning on a global scale. He knew it was a weak explanation even as he said it. Katie shook her head. She told him that their equipment was working perfectly. The silence was real. Something had changed out there, and she did not know what it was. Ben asked her what she thought was happening. Katie looked out the window at the night sky. Stars filled the darkness, countless points of light that had always seemed to promise the existence of other life, other minds, other civilizations. Now those same stars felt different. They felt like eyes, watching and waiting. She told Ben that she did not know what was happening. But she had a feeling. She could not explain it logically, but deep in her gut, she felt that humanity was being observed. She felt that something had found them and was afraid. Ben laughed nervously. He asked her why anything out there would be afraid of humans. They were a small species on a small planet. They had barely reached their own moon. They were nothing compared to what might be waiting in the depths of space. Katie did not answer. She did not know how to explain the strange certainty she felt. She only knew that the silence was not empty. It was full of something. Full of waiting. She decided to write a paper about her findings. She would document the sudden disappearance of unexplained signals. She would note the changes in background radiation patterns. She would present the data and let others draw their own conclusions. She titled the paper, The Great Silence. She had no idea how accurate that title was. She had no idea that the silence she had detected extended across 17 galaxies. She had no idea that trillions of beings were holding their breath, hoping that the strange, terrifying creatures on the third planet from an ordinary yellow star would not notice them. She only knew that the universe had changed, and she was determined to find out why. In her small office, surrounded by equipment designed to listen to the stars, Katie Morgan became the first human to sense the fear of an entire galaxy. And somewhere beyond the orbit of Mars, a small probe continued its silent vigil, recording everything, transmitting nothing. The waiting had begun. Commander Vex Thrall received his new orders on a quiet morning aboard his survey vessel. The message came directly from the High Council, encrypted with the highest level of security protocols. He read it 3 times to make sure he understood. He was to maintain observation of the human homeworld. He was to continue collecting data on their activities and development. But under no circumstances was he to make contact. Under no circumstances was he to reveal his presence. Under no circumstances was he to allow the humans to discover that they were being watched. The penalty for violating these orders was immediate termination. Not of his command, of his existence. Vex Thrall had served the Dominion for over a century. He had received difficult orders before. He had never received orders that came with a death threat for disobedience. He understood what this meant. The Council was terrified. He ordered his crew to maintain their position at the edge of the Sol system. He instructed them to minimize all emissions that might be detectable. He told them to watch and wait and say nothing. On the Communion homeworld, Senior Archivist Zayalun had become the most famous individual in the galaxy. Her presentation to the Council had been leaked almost immediately. Now everyone wanted to hear her analysis. Everyone wanted to understand what the humans were. She gave a public address in the great amphitheater of the capital city. Billions watched across thousands of worlds as she stood before them and tried to explain the unexplainable. She told them that humans were not simply dangerous. Dangerous species were common. The Communion had dealt with dangerous species before. They had protocols for containment, negotiation, and if necessary, elimination. None of those protocols applied to humans. She told them that humans were not simply unpredictable. Unpredictable species existed throughout the galaxy. They could be studied, their patterns eventually understood, their behavior anticipated. But humans seemed to operate on a completely different system. They could be generous and cruel in the same moment. They could sacrifice everything for strangers and destroy everything for revenge. Individual humans could change completely over the course of their short lives, becoming entirely different beings from who they had been before. The audience listened in uneasy silence. Zayalun moved on to discuss human art and culture. She told them that this was perhaps the most confusing aspect of human existence. Humans created works of extraordinary beauty. Their music could produce emotional responses in species that had no ears. Their visual art captured light and shadow in ways that seemed almost impossible. Their stories explored the depths of love, sacrifice, hope, and redemption. And they also created works depicting their darkest impulses. Humans made art about murder. They made art about torture. They made art about war and suffering, and the consumption of their own kind. They found these works entertaining. Sometimes the same humans who wept at beautiful music would spend their leisure time watching stories about serial killers and monsters. A voice from the audience asked Zayalon if humans were insane. Perhaps their minds were simply broken. Perhaps they were a species of lunatics who had somehow developed technology. Zayalun shook her head. She told them that this would be easier to understand if it were true. But humans were not insane. They were fully aware of what they were. They studied themselves obsessively. They had developed entire fields of knowledge dedicated to understanding their own behavior. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, history. They documented their atrocities and analyzed their triumphs. They debated endlessly about why they did the things they did, and then they did those things anyway. A military advisor asked the obvious question. What happened when humans left their planet? What happened when they developed faster than light travel? What happened when they met other species? Zayalun was quiet for a long moment. Then she admitted that she did not know. She could not predict human behavior because there was no consistent pattern to predict. Humans might greet alien life with open arms and peaceful intentions. They might also respond with immediate violence. They might do both simultaneously, different groups of humans taking different approaches. The only thing she could say with certainty was that humans would not simply accept a secondary role in the galactic order. They would not be content to remain a minor species on a minor planet. Whatever they did, They would do it with the full intensity that characterized everything else about them. The audience sat in troubled silence. On Earth, Dr. Katie Morgan had published her paper on the Great Silence. It had attracted attention in the scientific community, though many of her colleagues dismissed her conclusions as premature. Dr. Ben Harper remained skeptical but supportive. He helped her refine her data and defend her methodology against critics. Katie did not care about the criticism. She knew what she had found. The universe had changed. Something had happened out there. Something that affected regions of space far beyond anything humans could currently observe. The silence was real. And it had begun at almost exactly the same time her equipment had detected those strange fluctuations near Mars. She did not believe in coincidences. Katie began working on a new project. She collaborated with researchers around the world to develop more sensitive detection equipment. If someone was watching humanity, she wanted to know who they were. If someone was afraid of humanity, she wanted to know why. She spent long nights in her office, staring at data streams and trying to find patterns in the emptiness. Her colleagues worried about her health. Her friends worried about her obsession. But Katie could not stop. The question drove her forward with an intensity she had never felt before. What had humanity done to deserve the attention of an entire galaxy? In the archives of the Communion, the human files continued to grow. The probe orbiting Mars transmitted endless streams of data. Human technology advanced every day. Human culture shifted and evolved. Human conflicts erupted and subsided. Every piece of information was cataloged, analyzed, and shared. Species that had been hostile to each other for millennia now found common ground in their shared fear of humanity. Old enemies became allies. Ancient grudges were forgotten. The human files had done what nothing else in galactic history had accomplished. They had united the entire Communion in a single purpose: survival. Commander Vex Thrall watched Earth from his position at the edge of the solar system. He saw the lights of human cities glowing on the night side of the planet. He watched their spacecraft moving between Earth and their moon. He tracked their satellites and their communications, and their endless activity. They seemed so small from this distance. So fragile, so limited, but Vex Thrall knew better. He had read the archives. He understood what those small, fragile creatures were capable of doing. He understood that distance and technology meant nothing to a species that could not be stopped, could not be predicted, and could not be understood. He maintained his position. He continued his observation. And he waited for the day when humanity would finally look up and notice that they were not alone. That day was coming. He could feel it in the way the humans reached for the stars. He could see it in their restless energy, their constant pushing against the boundaries of what was possible. They would find the probe eventually. They would discover the truth, and when they did, the galaxy would learn what humanity looked like when it knew it was being watched. Vex Thrall hoped he would not be alive to see it. 50 years passed on Earth. 50 years of progress and change and relentless human ambition. Dr. Katie Morgan had retired from active research, but her legacy lived on. Her paper on the Great Silence had inspired a generation of scientists to search for answers. Her work had led to the development of detection systems more sensitive than anything humans had ever built, and her questions had never been answered. The universe remained silent, but humanity had not been idle. They had landed on Mars and built permanent settlements there. They had constructed space stations that housed thousands of people. They had developed mining operations in the asteroid belt. They had sent probes to the outer planets and the distant reaches of the solar system. They had done everything the galaxy feared they would do, and they were not finished. Dr. Amy Morgan stood in the control room of the new SETI facility in New Mexico, watching data streams flow across massive display screens. She was 53 years old. With her mother's sharp mind and her father's stubborn determination, she had spent her entire career searching for the answer to the question her mother had first asked decades ago. Why was the universe silent? Her husband Chris stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He was an engineer who had helped design the deep space probes that humanity was now sending to neighboring star systems. He understood her obsession, even if he did not share it. He had learned long ago that some questions could not be ignored. Amy stared at the data and frowned. Something was different tonight. The background radiation patterns had shifted slightly. It was barely detectable, just a minor fluctuation that most people would dismiss as noise. But Amy had been watching these patterns for 30 years. She knew them better than anyone alive. Something was out there. Something was watching. She began running analysis programs, filtering the data through every algorithm she had developed over her career. Chris watched her work in silence. He had seen this intensity before. He knew better than to interrupt. Hours passed. The facility grew quiet as other researchers went home for the night. Amy remained at her station, drinking cold coffee and refusing to rest. She was close to something. She could feel it. Near dawn, she found it. Buried in the background radiation, hidden in frequencies that human equipment had only recently learned to detect, there was a signal. It was not random. It was not natural. It was a message, repeated endlessly. Broadcast across every direction of space, for what appeared to be billions of light years. Amy ran the signal through her translation programs. The algorithms worked for nearly an hour, comparing the patterns to every known form of communication, searching for structure and meaning. Finally, the results appeared on her screen. The message was simple. 2 words, repeated over and over again in a form that seemed designed to be understood by any intelligence capable of detecting it. Quiet. They are listening. Amy stared at the words for a long time. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply sat there, trying to understand what she was seeing. The entire galaxy was warning itself about something. Trillions of beings across thousands of civilizations had agreed on a single message and were broadcasting it constantly in every direction. They were telling each other to be silent. They were telling each other to hide. And they were listening for something. Amy thought about her mother's research. She thought about the great silence that had fallen across the universe at almost exactly the same time human civilization had begun broadcasting signals into space. She thought about the strange fluctuations her mother had detected near Mars 50 years ago that had never been explained. She thought about everything humans had done in those 50 years. The wars they had fought. The technologies they had developed. The way they had spread across their solar system like a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. And then she understood. The galaxy was not warning itself about some distant threat. It was not hiding from an ancient enemy or a cosmic disaster. It was warning itself about humanity. It was hiding from humanity. It had been hiding from humanity for 50 years, ever since the first probe had arrived to study them. They were afraid. The most powerful civilizations in the known universe were afraid of the small, fragile creatures on the third planet from an ordinary yellow star. Amy sat back in her chair and laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone who had just discovered a truth so enormous that it changed everything they thought they knew about the universe. Chris looked at her with concern. He asked her what was wrong. He asked her what she had found. Amy turned to face him. She told him that they were not alone in the universe. She told him that the galaxy was full of intelligent life. More than they had ever imagined. She told him that all of those civilizations had been watching humanity for decades. And she told him that they were terrified. Chris did not understand. He asked her why anyone would be afraid of humans. They were just one species on one small planet. They had barely begun exploring their own solar system. They were nothing compared to civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. Amy smiled. She told him to think about it. Really think about it. Think about what humans had done over the course of their history. Think about what they had survived. Think about what they were capable of doing to each other and to anyone who stood in their way. Think about what it would look like to an outside observer. Chris was quiet for a long moment. Then his face changed as the realization hit him. He understood. He finally understood why the universe was silent. It was not because there was no one out there. It was because everyone out there was hiding. Amy saved the data and logged off her terminal. She stretched her tired muscles and looked out the window at the brightening sky. The sun was rising over the desert, painting the clouds in shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful. She thought about the message she had found. Quiet. They are listening. She thought about all those civilizations out there. watching and waiting, hoping that humanity would never notice them. She thought about what would happen when humans finally reached the stars and discovered the truth. Would they be angry at being watched? Would they be curious about the civilizations that feared them? Would they prove the galaxy right by responding with violence? Or would they prove it wrong by offering peace? Amy did not know. No one could know. That was what made humans so terrifying to the rest of the universe. They were impossible to predict. They contained every possibility within themselves. But standing there in the early morning light, watching the sun rise over her world, Amy felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt proud. Humanity had done something no other species had ever accomplished. They had united an entire galaxy. They had given trillions of beings a common cause, a shared purpose, something to agree on after millennia of conflict and division. Fear. It was not the legacy she would have chosen, but it was undeniably impressive. Amy went home to her family. She had breakfast with Chris and their children. She told them about her discovery, about the message hidden in the cosmic background radiation, about the galaxy that watched them from the darkness between the stars. Her children thought it was exciting. They asked questions about aliens and spaceships, and what would happen when humans finally made contact. Amy told them the truth. She told them that humanity's future among the stars would be whatever they decided to make it. They could be conquerors or peacemakers, explorers or destroyers. The choice was theirs, and somewhere out there, an entire universe was waiting to see what they would choose. The stars would still be there tomorrow, and so would humanity.